Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which celebrates Walktober in Maryland with a special Walkinar on pedestrian safety and equity, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Maryland Department of Transportation. My name is Jill Lemke. I serve as the Manager of Infrastructure and Sustainability at the Maryland Department of Planning. The Maryland Departments of Planning and Transportation work closely and in partnership to advance transportation and land use planning with the goal of supporting vibrant communities, promoting safe transportation options, and connecting all Marylanders to opportunities and each other. The Walkinar series takes place each year during the month of October as part of a larger webinar series produced by the Maryland Department of Planning, featuring a variety of smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website provides other valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities at planning.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. For more information on Walktober and related activities, please visit the Maryland Department of Transportation's website, where you can also find previous Walktober videos, information, and registration links for future events. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To receive AICP credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org, then log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for the event number 9277206. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the Department of Transportation, or the state of Maryland. Following their presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question for the speakers at any time by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. Before introducing our speakers, please enjoy this short welcome video from Joanna Green, MDOT Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs and Strategy.
Good morning. I'm Joanna Green, Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs and Strategy. Thank you for being here today as we celebrate Maryland's 4th annual Walktober, a month-long series of activities and educational events to promote safe walking and walkability. To learn more about Walktober and to find resources and events happening throughout the month, please visit our website. Following the success of the previous years, we're pleased to continue hosting a series of 4 webinars, or Walkinars, as we call them, each Thursday throughout the month. These Walkinars highlight innovative practices to support walking and walkability and provide important information on safety, equity, health, and infrastructure. To that end, here at MDOT, we are excited to announce the launch of our Sidewalk Data Inventory Collaboration Project, which will evaluate the feasibility of statewide sidewalk data inventory. Pedestrian access statewide to transit centers, major activity centers, and other locations that individuals seek to travel to and from is an essential part of creating an equitable, accessible region for everyone. Sidewalks are an important part of MDOT's new bicycle and pedestrian master plan, as well as the Complete Streets policy. During today's Walkinar, we will take a look at pedestrian equity. We'll hear from Michael Rodriguez, Director of Research at Smart Growth America, Matt Johnson, Bikeways Coordinator at the Montgomery County Department of Transportation, and Charles Marohn Jr., founder and president of Strong Towns and author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild America's prosperity. I'm looking forward to today's event. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Green. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Michael Rodriguez is Director of Research for Smart Growth America, where he oversees quantitative and qualitative research. His expertise is in the fiscal and economic impact of transportation and infrastructure projects, particularly those related to smart growth and walkability. Michael is co-author of Foot Traffic Ahead 2023, a statistical survey of walkable urbanism in the United States, an econometric model research study in downtown Detroit, and a study of walkability in metropolitan New York. Michael brings over 14 years of professional urbanism experience to Smart Growth America from roles at top real estate, research, and transportation organizations. As a resident of Tysons Corner, Virginia, Michael participates and promotes smart growth in one of the fastest growing regions in the country. He holds a dual MPA and an MS in urban and regional planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is currently a PhD doctoral candidate in public policy at George Washington University. Matt Johnson is a capital project manager and the Bikeways Coordinator for the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. He has 15 years of experience working in planning and project management in Montgomery County. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Public Policy from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a Master of Community Planning from the University of Maryland, College Park. Charles Marohn, also known as Chuck to friends and colleagues, is the founder and president of Strong Towns. He is a civil engineer and a land use planner with decades of experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a Master of Urban and Regional Planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Chuck is the author of Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity, published in 2019, and Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for a Strong Town, published in 2021. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast and is a primary writer of Strong Towns web content. He has presented Strong Towns concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America. Plan Medicine named him one of the 10 most influential urbanists of all time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael, our first speaker, and his presentation, Dangerous by Design.
All right, thank you. So thanks everybody on this panel, and it's great to join everyone this morning. I'm coming to you from a library in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where we're doing some work with this region on some of their walkability issues, even out here in the Berkshire. So it's a lucky time to see the fall foliage out here. And for this webinar, I wanted to talk about one of our signature reports, Foot Traffic Ahead 2023, which we released earlier this year, and what went on there, what went into it, and how we measure walkability and what it really means in terms of various outcomes in economics and overall social equity policy. And we have a lot of dimensions in which we measure this, and to go over this with you today. First, for those of you who aren't familiar with my organization here, Smart Growth America, with our group, we're a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C., but we do work all throughout the country. We work in various areas through thought leadership. We do technical assistance and advocacy. So Transportation for America is part of our team and our Complete Streets Coalition. So I sit there and do the research parts of a lot of the signature reports that we do in the thought leadership, in order to get out there, make the research case for the smart growth issues, especially things like walkability and complete streets. And that's who we are. So overall, about this report, I mean, a lot of text on here, but basically our Foot Traffic Ahead report has been a signature report of ours now going on 4 iterations, where what we do is we look at the America's largest metros, and we did something that people like to click on, which is, in order to get a lot of eyeballs, we like to rank things because people love rankings. So we do more than that. We do a lot of great data digging into coming up about how we develop our rankings, which you'll see, to identify where do we see walkable urbanism in the United States in our largest metro areas, and which of our metro areas has the most of their stuff, their real estate, inside these places that we call walkable urban places. So jumping right into some of the major findings of this report, one of the most important things that we talk about, and this is myself, my co-author, Christopher Lineberger, who many of you may know, and he's one of my partners at Places Platform, is this idea that thinking about suburb and city and these old dichotomies is insufficient. It's been kind of wrong, and we like to focus on this type of a matrix. You could divide the world better by thinking about where we see walkability and where we don't see walkability, and places that are more regionally significant and places that are more locally serving. In a broad scale, you could just decide what you mean by walkable versus drivable, and we have some definitions of where those cutoffs happen. And then your regionally significant and locally serving places, that's a difference at the top there, that top left. Those are typically your downtowns and your places that have the most regional importance to your economies. They have the most jobs. They have a lot of the retail sales. Very, very small portion of regions' lands, less than 1%, actually less than half of a percent typically is in those places. We call those our walk-ups, walkable urban places, or type 1s. Then we have these walkable neighborhoods. They tend to be about 1, maybe 2, 3%, depending on the region of what we see. So these are places that are walkable. You know, many of these types of places, nice neighborhoods. They may not be regionally significant in terms of major contribution to the economy. They're important, but they tend to serve the local area. And we have these things, drive-ins that we've called, that typically they're very important to your regional economy. In fact, my backyard's been one of these. Tyson's Corner, a place where there's a lot of jobs, but hasn't been very much walkability. Other places like this are industrial centers, places that just naturally aren't going to lend themselves to walkability, places like military installations, airports, and the like. And then lastly, you have really everything else. So when you think about this, what we find, one big finding we have is far less than 2% of the land of metropolitan America is devoted, and this is overall, including everything that's there, is devoted to something that we would call walkability. And when we get to our policy recommendations, we're not saying that 100% of everything should or would even look like that. There's always going to be open space, there's always going to be other places, but that those numbers should just go up. Maybe if we got 2% to 3% or 4% would be a huge contribution to our economies and our way of life. So what we do with this report is actually make the case that despite what we've heard about the death of cities, or despite what we've heard about that people want old suburbia and sprawl, there's market indicators and demand indicators that people continue to choose walkable urban places. They've been doing so for the past couple of real estate cycles, and we continue to see evidence that supports that. We know that there's a limited supply of this. Effectively high demand for walkability. There's not much supply. What we have is very limited. And so what happens? Well, you're going to see prices go up. When we talk about this COVID issue, okay, so the demand dipped a little bit the past couple years, but those premiums still are there, meaning we still see premiums in prices and in sales, and what that means is the demand still exists. It may have been attenuated a little bit by some of these post-COVID trends, but in fact, and my prediction is that we're just going to go back to a relatively more balanced norm. And if anything, we may see more residences in our downtown areas as we get our downtowns out of being over-officed, as they've always been, and have become more actual neighborhoods and cities with people. And lastly, these type 2 places, these walkable neighborhoods, are incredibly important, and they've been growing an important contribution to regional economies going on. So we know people continue to choose walkable urban places, and one of the ways we see this is the price premium. If you compare the prices and rental rates for those first 3 products, office product, retail, real estate product, and multifamily rental, those are your apartments, 40% across the board, generally across our 35 top metro areas, of a price premium, or excuse me, 40-some% for multifamily retail. In for sale housing, those are your sale prices. We see that walkability has about a 30% premium. So these are rather big premiums for the investor class, or people who focus on that, which is part of our audience at Smart Growth America. It's not just, it's really everybody, from the investor, from the capital side, to the actual communities themselves and the people who work in them. Putting this all together, all these elements are quite important. And this supports the idea that, like I was saying, when we have high demand and low supply, not enough of these walkable places in terms of where they are, and not enough stuff inside the places that we do have, it's going to drive up cost. So we've heard this discussion all over the country. I think everyone on here mostly knows about the issues when it comes to supply, the issues when it comes to the factors and the policies that are forcing that, and some of the reactions that have been happening across the country. I mean, Chuck would know in Minnesota, some of the issues going on in Minneapolis, we see California, but a lot of these issues in terms of getting supply in walkability and creating more walkability throughout our regions is quite important as a policy recommendation. And like I was saying, to paraphrase Mark Twain saying that the reports of the death of walkable urban cities and towns are much exaggerated. Yeah, the downtowns have been hurt. We saw about 83% in downtown DC is, in my backyard here, is considered office. So it's a big chunk of our downtowns in terms of the portfolio. The eggs are in the office basket, and that's been hurting some of the prices there. So I think on the office side, that may be attenuated, but we still see these premiums when it comes to housing. And in fact, I don't really think that we've seen very much in the way of great deals in walkability in terms of your rental rates. If one is an apartment renter, those prices have gone up. And even if they were attenuated during COVID a little bit, we have seen some increasing housing price pressure. And I think a lot of communities, especially in Maryland, have been, and that's inclusive of suburban Maryland and in Baltimore and your other communities throughout the state, have been seeing this. And in this area, we'll focus on top 35. So we're talking about, from what we can see here, is would be suburban Maryland and what would be the Baltimore metropolitan region. Like I said, also, we see these type 2 places being quite important. About 90% of the square footage in these areas tends to be residential. This tends to be both a mix of rental and for sale housing. To the extent that you have missing middle, these are the places that we see this. We see those townhomes, those 2 to 5 story areas. And these support a lot of our retail, schools, and local communities like that. An interesting thing to note is a lot of these places are pre-war, pre-1950s. There are a lot of those traditional neighborhood design communities as well. They're neighborhoods that were built with a different imprint and were often there before a lot of the more restrictive levels of zoning that we've seen through the later 20th century. And when we look at the economic contribution, we're able to impute down GDP down to quite a local level, and we're able to see that these walkable urban places, this is the whole U.S. Okay, so the top 35 metro areas in the U.S. out of that pie are about 55% of the whole pie. When we look at that, remember there was 0.2% of the land, or less than 1%, because it depends where you look. That tiny sliver of less than 0.5% of the land of 35 metro areas constitutes about 19% of the nation's GDP. There's an interesting factoid specifically about New York that I had looked up one time. There's about 2% of the nation's GDP is produced on Manhattan south of 59th Street. So there are some pretty big heavy hitters in terms of walkable urban places. And it makes sense. A lot of our major jobs and economic contribution are precisely in there. So they're quite important places to the national economy, and they generate a huge range of benefits. We know about these things. We talk about them a lot at Smart Growth America in terms of increased health, and a lot of work that we've done with CDC shows these issues with lower incidences of mortality rate. When you have more walkability, more opportunities for alternative transportation and cycling. And we know that the built environment generates about 70% of overall greenhouse gas emissions, but as you move from a suburban place towards a walkable urban place, those greenhouse gas emissions typically drop by about 50 to 70% compared to a typical single family home. So that's inclusive of your transportation emissions. This is a very big environmental cause as well, and we like to make that point. So in order to get to some of these recommendations and what we need to do, well, we need to build more and build more housing. And this isn't just in the places that currently exist. So there's two ways of doing this. You can bolster your walkable urban places and your walkable communities that you have and increase the amount of supply that's in there in terms of housing opportunities that exist in those places. And then there's also creating new places or evolving places that were not walkable into places that are walkable. And this is the big effort and huge undertaking that is happening in my backyard that I'm very active in Tyson's Corner. Look, it's not walkable. It hasn't been. That's exactly the point. And the point is that a place like that is trying to transform to something we call walkable. It's trying to increase its housing supply. There's a lot of deliveries happening there in terms of both for sale and rental housing. And if a place like that can transform and become walkable, it gives us more solid indications that that's a way to evolve a lot of places throughout the United States. And there's a lot of folks across the country that I talk to that are looking to places like that as like Tyson's as a model, that if they can do it, well, then it can be done somewhere else. Unfortunately, if Tyson's fails, we think a lot of other places. So there's a lot hinging on places like that. And it's not just there, in Atlanta and LA and a lot of other places like that. But building housing is a big one part of this. So I think I buried the lead, and I did that a little on purpose. I didn't want everyone focused too much on the rankings, but here you are, sort of these are the top rankings and some of our bottom rankings. And I'm sorry that if I forget off the top of my head where your community, so you have your suburban Maryland communities are going to sit there in that number 3 region in the Washington, D.C. These are metropolitan areas. And then you have Baltimore that sits somewhere in the middle there. I forget off the top of my head where it is. But of course, I encourage everybody to look up Foot Traffic Ahead 2023. You could read the whole report, including our methodology and what went into this. So we see that New York is up there. It's always going to be most of its more of its supply, 73% of its office is in walkability. That's how you would read this. 55% of DC's office is inside walkability, and so on and so forth. When you put it all together and we make this into an index, we have these rankings, so we're not too surprised at the top and often not too surprised at the bottom. We promote the idea that a lot of these places should actually move forward. And with time being a little limited, I want to get into how we talk about social equity, because what we find is there's a lot of places where they may not have a lot of walkability in terms of our overall score, but of the walkability that they do have, they are affordable places. They tend to be relatively accessible within their region. They have decent transit quality relative to their region. And people who live there don't have much in that region, don't have as much distance to get to walkability. And so what we see that is interesting that we see Cleveland kind of pop up towards the top of one of these regions in terms of what we see. And you see Baltimore there at number 7 in terms of social equity. And that's a lot driven by the housing costs. So, you know, there's a lot of neighborhoods that are walkable in these areas. And there are a lot of these, frankly, are neighborhoods that are traditional areas that are a lot of people of color live there, whether it's Black or brown communities that live in these communities that are older and have the bones of walkability and a lot of the zoning that has traditionally supported that. And that's what we see. So of the walkability you see there, you see that it tends to be affordable, that it tends to have better transit compared to the rest of the region. This proximity idea, that's if you plop a random person in the region, how far are they from the closest walkable place? And if you have more walkability spread throughout the region, I like noting New York does quite poorly on that measure. And why? It's because it rests on its laurels. Most of New York's walkability is in the core, whereas a region like Cleveland is a little more spread out throughout the region when you actually measure the way that we measure these spatially. So those differences make quite a difference in terms of the dispersion of walkability throughout a region, which we think it's important not to just have everything in the core. And we have some for the market folks out here. We look at some of these market indicators of momentum, market shift share index, and absorption trends, and all these other issues in there. The point being, in a bottom line, is that we see increasing support for walkability in regions, and we see a lot of momentum when we focus on that word, on trends, on where you're coming from. You're going to actually see some of the bottom doing quite highly. So don't focus on the formula for right now, but that's in there for people keeping score at home. But we see that on these measures of momentum, some of the places that aren't quite walkable, Las Vegas, San Antonio, end up kind of coming to the top. And that's because there isn't much going on. The way you might think about this is there isn't as much real estate activity going on, or whatever there is, they may not be very walkable, but whatever is happening today and over the past few years, whatever we see going on in terms of absorption, it tends to be happening in whatever walkable places they do have. So San Antonio, not high on walkability lists, but that's where the activity is happening in San Antonio today. That's how you kind of read this. So this does have a little bit of the idea of low base and high reward in terms of you might think of this as your most improved list type by another way. So a lot of indication on this market momentum of places like this kind of coming up throughout the region. And we put this in terms of this index, and you see where these areas are happening. For this audience, I like to focus on this idea that Baltimore is up there for the folks in the Baltimore metropolitan region, in this future vision area, meaning you're below on both of these measures in terms of our current index, below the average. That doesn't necessarily mean bad, just in the middle of the pack, and below average. So we hope that we're going to see a little bit more going on in terms of these regions and opportunities for momentum that we see in the index that we talk about in our report. So recommending, and to wrap it up here, we'd like to be able to improve affordability, and social equity is very important for everything that we do. These are the overall recommendations that we come to. Growing the supply of these equitable and walkable places, that's just the places that exist, and creating more of them throughout the region. We really need to support non-auto opportunities in order to foster and bolster these places that exist. Affordability is important. We understand the concerns around affordability, price pressure, displacement, and all those issues, and those needs conscientious policies in order to mitigate the things that the market would do, which is contribute towards price pressure and some of that displacement. The only way to get to attenuate that is by conscientious social policy in those areas. And to plan for the future, that regions need to actually make a conscious policy to think that the growth that we want to happen should go into places that are going to be walkable, or to the extent that we have growth, that it should go into places that we already have the infrastructure. There's a net fiscal impact argument that we make at Smart Growth America. I know Chuck talks a lot about that as well, that the sort of Ponzi scheme that happens in continued growth throughout the urban exterior and the urban fringe. And we're better off focusing on the places that are walkable, or to the extent that we build more, to have those places be walkable. And that's most of my report. And with that, I'll pass it off to Matt.
Thank you, Michael. Great presentation. Let me get my slides up here. All right, so I think they're coming up now. Thank you, everyone. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm a capital projects manager and the Bikeways Coordinator at the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about a great project that I worked on back in 2021, and the work continues from that project. And that is a project to improve the way we design streets for people who have vision disabilities. So the background of the project was that we have been building floating bus stops, or bus boarding islands, in the county since 2017 as part of our low stress bikeway program. And this construction started some conversations with our community of people with disabilities in the county. And this dialogue continues, and it's been a very productive conversation. We, I think, have learned on both sides, learned a lot about each other's perspectives. And these conversations told us that there was a lot more that we could do, not just related to bike lanes and bus stops, but throughout the county, to make Montgomery County safer and more accessible for people with disabilities. And so in 2020, we applied to the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments for a grant to create a toolkit and pilot design. and we did receive that grant. The project resulted in 2 deliverables. The first is a toolkit called Planning and Designing Streets to be Safer and More Accessible for People with Vision Disabilities. This report is available on our webpage, and I will put a link to it in the chat after I finish the presentation. And I'm going to go through kind of the high-level elements of the report. And it also resulted in a pilot design for the intersection of Fenton Street and Ellsworth Drive and downtown Silver Spring to show how the different elements from the report could be combined into a pilot design for use in practice. And I'll also be talking about that at the end. So I think there's a little bit of a lag between when I changed the slide and when it actually appears on the screen, so I apologize for that. I don't have time to go into the depth of everything in the report, so I'm just going to hit the high-level topics. But we could easily spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about this report, and it's a really great report. I think it explains a lot. Even if you work in accessible design, I think you'll learn something from the report. So I encourage everyone to go take a look at the report after the presentation. But the report can basically be broken down into 4 main sections. An introduction, which is not just an introduction to the report, but an introduction to understanding people with vision disabilities, how they navigate, how their different kinds of disabilities impact the way they get around in the world, and also some best practices and lessons learned from other jurisdictions globally. The next section talks about process tools. So this report is not just about the designs, all right, that's easy. But the process tools are talking about how we engage people, how we make sure that we're following up on projects that have been constructed to improve the next iteration, how we're training our staff and things like that. So the engagement is really critical because it's important that we're not planning and designing for people with vision disabilities or other disabilities. It's important that we're planning with people with vision disabilities. Because if they're not engaged from the very beginning, then we're not really being inclusive in that process. The report also talks about design tools, which is essentially, if you think about like the ingredients in a recipe, right? It talks about the different things we can do, and then we get into some designs, which is the synthesis of those ingredients, the recipe, if you will. So I'm just going to really kind of go through this as quickly as possible because there's so much to cover. So some of the key facts about people with vision disabilities. The CDC reports that 1 in 4 adults have a disability that impacts major life activities, and 2 in 5 people over the age of 65 have some type of disability. Disabilities may range from difficulties in seeing or hearing, and even walking and thinking. Approximately 85% of people who are legally blind still have some residual vision. So I think there's this misperception that if you see someone walking with a long white cane or with a seeing eye dog, that they can't see anything at all. But in many cases, they do have some residual vision left. And another misconception is that people who are blind read Braille. Most people with vision disabilities do not read Braille, especially if they lost their vision later in life. And so it's really important that when we're designing signs and the like, that we're including raised text and not just Braille. Because if you're only including Braille on signs, you're missing a portion of the audience. This next slide talks about some of the ways people might experience vision loss. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are different kinds of vision loss, but these different types of vision loss impact the way people see in different ways. So for example, the upper right corner shows central vision loss, and someone with central vision loss may have a really hard time reading signs or focusing on words in the environment, so it may be difficult for them to figure out where they are. Someone with peripheral vision loss does have that central vision, but they may have a lot of difficulty seeing curbs or stairs because they don't have that peripheral vision. It may be difficult for them when crossing the street to see approaching traffic, especially bicycles or scooters. And we also have overall acuity loss, which is sort of a general inability to focus on things. But there are other kinds, including things like night blindness, and other types of vision loss. So it's important to be thinking through as we design that we're designing through that we're designing for all different types of vision loss and not focusing on any one kind. And the report talks more about that. I don't have the time to go into all that in depth. But there are some environments that are especially confusing for people who have vision disabilities. For example, decorative sidewalks can be really challenging. The picture you see on the left there has bands of white and dark gray pavers alternating. And for someone who has low vision, this may appear to be steps. And so this can be really confusing for people. And we need to be thinking through, if we're doing an aesthetic treatment, if the only reason we're doing this is for aesthetics, but it impacts someone's civil rights, we might want to rethink how we're designing these kinds of streetscapes. Stairs that blend in can also be really challenging, like the center picture here, where the stairs are really hard to distinguish from the sidewalk. And this could be a tripping hazard for someone who has low vision, who might not realize there are steps there. So thinking through how we're using contrasting colors in the environment is really important. And also crosswalks that maybe don't make it to the ramp, or they kind of connect after you step off the ramp. These can be really hard for pedestrians to line up in and to stay in as they work across the street. So these can be really confusing for people. Other examples of bad designs, and I believe all of these pictures are from Montgomery County, are things like apex ramps, like the picture on the left. An apex ramp is where the curb ramp is at the sort of center of the radius, which means it points diagonally into the intersection and doesn't necessarily connect to either crosswalk. A lot of times when we have intersections with really big radii, this tends to happen, and it can be really confusing for someone who has vision disabilities to find the crosswalks and to line up appropriately. Other examples, like the center picture here, shows an example where we have a really big depressed curb, but there's only detectable warning surfaces in 2 particular locations. And if you approach this and miss those, you might not ever realize that you're about to cross the street. So it's important that we have big depressed openings that the detectable warning surface stretches across the entire opening. And another problem with really big intersections, aside from the fact that they encourage fast driving, is that it can be difficult in some cases for a person with vision disabilities to even realize that they've gotten to a corner, because there's sort of this gradual curve, and they may not even realize that they're passing the location where they need to cross the street. So it can be really confusing. Crossing streets is also really important. So it's a major hazard for people with disabilities. So areas that are particularly challenging are when we have a lack of painted lines or a faded marking, if the crosswalk is particularly busy, if the intersection is really wide, or if the crosswalk is skewed. All of these are the case in the picture that's shown here, which is in downtown Silver Spring. Also, knowing when to cross is a really critical challenge for people with vision disabilities. You have to keep in mind they may not be able to see the pedestrian signals. So they're relying a lot on sound. So areas that are really challenging are T intersections. When you're walking parallel to the stem of the T and you want to cross the top of the T, there's not really any parallel traffic. All that traffic is either turning left or right. And that can be confusing. So thinking through how we're designing our intersections and our signal operations is really critical. And areas with a lot of ambient noise can also be challenging, because they can make it hard for people with vision disabilities to locate the accessible signals. If they do exist, it can make it hard to understand which traffic is going if there's just a really high ambient noise level. So lots of challenges out there that we need to think through as we're designing our spaces. Also really important are the principles of accessible design that the report talks about. So safety is first. Montgomery County is a Vision Zero jurisdiction, which means we will not accept any pedestrian deaths or serious injuries on our roadways. People who have disabilities are especially vulnerable users on our road network, and so we need to work really hard to make sure that they're protected and safe. Making sure that we're in compliance with all federal and state laws, including things like the PROAG guidelines that were just adopted. Making sure that we're inclusive, which means that we're involving people from the very beginning in designs, and not trying to design for them without them being in the room. Consistency and predictability is also really important for people with vision disabilities, because they can't see different designs every time they walk out there. So it's important that if we're designing bus stops, that we try and design every bus stop or most bus stops to be pretty similar so that they don't have to guess or figure it out every time they get to a bus stop, that they can kind of figure out what the layout looks like, just as an example. And then of course, maintenance is really, really critical. If you do everything right, but then you don't maintain it, and your detectable warning surface pops up after the first snowstorm, and you never replace it, then you're not building an accessible world. So we have to make sure that we're maintaining our sidewalks, maintaining our crosswalks, maintaining our accessible infrastructure, or it doesn't exist anymore. The report also goes into some process tools. I'm going to kind of skim through them. But one of the really interesting things that we did as part of this project is that we created tactile graphics, like the one you can see on the picture here. So I'll just point out that effective engagement requires a proactive approach. If you're dealing with a situation where you have a lot of people with vision disabilities who might be impacted by a design, perhaps there's a blind community center there, or it's just a new design that's going to impact transit access. We're keeping in mind that people who have vision disabilities are much more reliant on transit than the general population because they generally can't drive. So when you're working on designs that have an outsized impact, it's important that we're being proactive with that engagement. They may not be able to see the flyers you put up around the neighborhood. They may not read the postcard that you send out to everyone. So working through those advocacy organizations to try and reach out to people and say, hey, do you know people in this neighborhood who might be impacted? Or do you have cheerleaders in the community who can help us get the word out to people who have vision disabilities or other disabilities? Making sure that when you're doing projects like this, that you're effectively engaging by bringing the tools that are necessary. So these tactile graphics mean, if you have a typical meeting, you might have display boards, but a person who has vision disabilities, they can't read your display boards. They can't read the roll map you put out on the table. But if you create a tactile graphic like this one, they can use their fingers to understand the plans. So this graphic is 3D. The sidewalk is actually higher than the roadway. The sidewalk and road surfaces have different textures. The bike lane has a texture, the crosswalk has a texture. Even the detectable warning surfaces have textures that are tactile for people with fingers, so they can feel the plans and understand the plans in ways that they couldn't do with just a paper graphic. So we've been piloting these on a couple different projects, and they're very effective at helping. And so we would encourage you to consider these if you have particular projects. It's also important that as you build new projects that you're going out and making sure they're not having impacts that you didn't foresee by bringing out stakeholders who have disabilities to these areas to give you feedback. So the picture on your screen here shows some MCDOT staffers chatting with two people who have vision disabilities, one of whom is the late Charlie Crawford. But this project was not even finished yet. It was still under construction. And we had them out talking about how we could improve these designs. And we did modify the final product based on their feedback, even though we hadn't even finished the project yet. So we got some great feedback from Charlie and Susan there. And we encourage these kinds of engagement opportunities. When you build new infrastructure, you're not going to get it right the first time. This is not trying to be offensive, but you will not get it right the first time. We didn't get it right the first time. You probably don't get it right the second time either. But every time you build a project, you should use it as an opportunity to improve the next generation of design. And of course, when the opportunity arises, to go back and make adjustments to those projects that you've already completed. Another recommendation of the report is that staff be regularly trained on accessible planning and design, and that this training should be updated periodically because the state of the practice changes, it evolves. So we're working on starting this process in the county so that everyone would get this training every 5 years or so, and new hires would receive the training as soon as they're hired. So we're hoping to do the first round of that next year. And we're very excited to be working on this element. The report also gets into design tools. We don't have time to really go into too much into depth, but the report talks about how people with different levels of disability navigate. So for example, someone who's legally blind, who has very little eyesight left, mostly is going to use their hearing to navigate the world. They might use a long white cane for additional help, or a seeing eye dog. People with low vision tend to rely on that residual vision that's left. They may also use assistive devices like a long white cane or a guide dog. There are some people who are both deaf and blind, and they can only rely on tactile cues. So it's important that we're designing the world for all types of disability and all levels of disability. There are different tactile cues that the report gets into. We don't have time to go into all this in depth, but things like detectable edges, like a raised curb or a depressed curb, can help people navigate. Detectable changes in surface texture, like for example, grass next to the sidewalk is detectable. Concrete and asphalt are not distinguishable. So if you're using like a concrete sidewalk and an asphalt bike lane at the same elevation, those are not detectable to people with vision disabilities. You need to do more than that. Detectable changes in slope, like a ramp, can be useful. Using tactile walking surface indicators like detectable warning surface or detectable guidance surfaces can be helpful. And tactile delineator surfaces are edge treatments. There's still a lot of research needed on those, but finding ways to delineate an edge when necessary, it can be really useful. Curb ramps are also really critical. We should avoid diagonal ramps or apex ramps wherever possible. Those should really never be constructed. And that's where there's a ramp sort of in the center of the radius that doesn't directly align with either crosswalk. We should always strive for directional curb ramps where possible. And of course, as I mentioned before, wherever there's a level opening, that the detectable warning surface needs to stretch around the entire opening. That's actually a federal requirement. Detectable guidance surfaces are also kind of new to the United States. We've used them a little bit in Montgomery County. These pictures are actually from the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. They were piloting these around a couple stations in the East Bay. So this is just an example of how they can be used. They're very common in Asia and Europe. They're becoming more common in Canada, and they are starting to appear in the United States, but we don't have a lot of usage of them here. But the report talks about how to use them and even how to design them. It's really critical to be also thinking about wheelchair users. So our report talks about, like, when you have a pedestrian access route, that you're not centering this in the middle of the access route, because then it might be impacting wheelchair users. You want to put it off to one side so that wheelchair users are still able to navigate the sidewalk without riding on top of this. It can be uncomfortable for them. So thinking about that's really critical. So the report goes into a lot about how to design them. I'm not going to go into that level of detail, but feel free to read the report. Visual cues are really important in design, so thinking about things like using contrasting colors and shades, using familiar patterns, and making sure that we have consistent levels of lighting. These are all really important elements of design. So again, using contrast to help people and not just as an aesthetic choice is a really important thing to think about. I brought this example up before, but here's kind of a blurry image that might look to you like steps. It's actually not steps, it's a plaza in front of the Silver Spring Library in downtown Silver Spring. And this has alternating bands of light and dark pavers. We actually had our focus group walk through this plaza, and that's what we heard from people with low vision, was they kept expecting these to be stairs. And so when you're preparing to step down or step up and it's level, it can be a balance issue. But to make matters worse, this plaza actually has a set of stairs in it that are not distinguished. So you have someone who's going to be walking across this plaza for 50 or 100 feet, and they keep being told visually that there's a step, and then there's not, and then they actually encounter a step. So it's really important to think through this, and this plaza could have been designed in such a way that where it's still aesthetically pleasing, but doesn't trick people into thinking they're walking through stairs. So it's important to think about these decisions. There are some studies that show that having lateral bounding lines in a crosswalk is helpful for people with low vision to stay aligned. The Montgomery County standard for crosswalks is to use either what's called standard in this chart, or just the bounding lines for low volume crosswalks, or continental for high visibility crosswalks. But we're looking at moving toward the latter style, which is the DC standard, because it has the lateral bounding lines and might help people stay aligned better. And we did do some testing of this in the county, and we did see some positive results. Also important to think about how people navigate. They use a lot of audible cues, so things like listening to the traffic sounds that's running parallel to them, hearing other pedestrians, using their cane to tap different surfaces and hear different sounds. Echoes can help them. Someone who's navigating they might live near or their office might be near a fountain. So for example, they walk by every day, and once they get to the fountain, they know I have 50 more steps, then I get to my office entrance. Or maybe they walk past a coffee shop and they smell fresh coffee, and they know that they kind of know where they are. Accessible pedestrian signals are really important. Audible messaging really important as well. However, there are some issues with the audible elements in the world. One of those issues is that the electrification of the vehicle fleet means that vehicles are becoming much quieter, and bikes and scooters are nearly silent. So it makes it hard for people to know when it's safe to cross the street, if there's an electric car there that they can't hear, or a bike or a scooter that they can't hear and they can't see. So really challenging things. Things like all pedestrian crossings can also be challenging because a lot of blind people are trained to cross when the parallel traffic moves. So if we have a situation where we don't have pedestrians going when the cars are going, but we have an all pedestrian phase, it may be difficult for them to stay aligned, and it may be difficult for them to know when it's safe to cross. So it's really important that when we have situations like this, we're always using accessible pedestrian signals. I'm just going to kind of skip ahead a little bit here because I think we're running a little bit long. Also really important that we're designing our accessible pedestrian signals to be accessible. So in the pictures you see on your screen here, the top picture shows a situation where the accessible pedestrian signal is mounted correctly, but there's a big pedestal that the signal pole is mounted on, and this person in a wheelchair literally cannot reach the push button. And the bottom picture shows a picture where the sidewalk doesn't connect to the push button. Both of these are in Montgomery County. So we have a long way to go, but it's important to be thinking through these design elements when we're designing the streets. It's important that they be located in predictable locations, that they're reachable, and that they're loud enough that they can be heard over the ambient noise. And then we can get into some designs. So this is kind of the synthesis of these different design tools. The pedestrian access route is the most important thing. So the picture you see on top here from downtown Silver Spring is a good example. It's not perfect, but it's a good example of where we have a wide, straight pedestrian access route that is contrasted in color with the furniture zone on the left and the cafe zone on the right, using different paper types. So this is a really good design. It's free of obstructions. There's no utility poles, no fire hydrants, no benches, nothing in that pedestrian access route. And when it shifts gradually. The bottom picture is a bad example. This is from downtown Bethesda. And this is a situation where the pedestrian access route actually has a double 90-degree turn to stay on it. The furniture zone, or the cafe zone, and the sidewalk, all of it's the same paver type. It's just really difficult to navigate. We have these sharp turns. You wouldn't have a road designed like this, right? You wouldn't make drivers do this kind of maneuver. We shouldn't expect pedestrians to do it either. So these kinds of turns are really confusing. It'd be very hard for a person with vision disabilities to navigate this space, especially going in the direction opposite the arrow, walking toward the camera, because it's easy to miss that ramp cutout, and you might find yourself in a situation where you only have steps to descend. And if you're in a wheelchair, you certainly can't do that. So it's important to design these things and to be very intentional when you're laying out your streets. These are some, this slide just shows some pictures from the report that talk about how to design the streetscape. And again, I really encourage everyone to take some time to just have a look at the report for more guidance on how to design these kinds of spaces so that they're more accessible. And then just really quickly, I'll walk through the pilot design, which should be coming up on your screen momentarily.
I hate to cut in on you, but we're running very long. If you could start to wrap up, that would be great. So we have time for our third speaker.
Yes, we're in the home stretch here. So I have like just a few slides left. So this design and this is available on our webpage as well. This shows the intersection of Fenton Street and Ellsworth Drive in downtown Silver Spring. It's in conjunction with a new bike lane that's being constructed. And this the report talks about how to design things. So looking at different things like using signals and signage, having raised crossings, how we use detectable warning surfaces and guidance surfaces, accessible signage, things like that. So I won't go into too much more detail since we're a little bit long. And I'll just talk about what the continuing work that we're doing as we wrap up here. So the study was completed in June of 2021. We're committed to making sure that it doesn't just gather dust on a shelf. So we're already taking the following steps. We did design a pilot intersection. We constructed a pilot intersection out of temporary materials last spring. We're working to upgrade our original floating bus stops to the pilot intersection designs next year. We're working on creating accessibility standards for the county. That's an ongoing process. We're also working on beginning our staff training. We're also already integrating these recommendations into projects that are in design. We're using tactile graphics as part of our design processes. We're also working toward having a regional summit on design elements, and we're working to develop and install better wayfinding signage at all of our existing floating bus stops. And I'll just quickly show these pictures. This is the end of my presentation. We constructed this mock-up of our bus boarding islands in April, and we brought about 24 participants out to this site to walk through it and give us, these were people with disabilities, to give us feedback. So this temporary installation was in place for about a week, and we brought out stakeholders. We also brought out the different transit operators from the region. They were all invited to observe. And this is just I'll get some really great feedback. So this is a great way we developed a pilot design. We actually tested it using temporary materials so people could actually come out and experience it in the real world to give us feedback. And now we're going to actually construct these next year. And with that, I do apologize for going a bit long. I'm going to turn it over to a man who needs no introduction, Chuck Marohn.
Wow, thank you. Very nice to be here. I'm just going to verify that you can see my screen. I'm pretty sure. I'm mostly familiar with GoToMeeting.
We all see it.
All right, sweet. Everybody remembers this, right? This period of time that was very, very eerie in 2020 when there was no traffic. I live in a small town a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul, here in central Minnesota, and it was very strange to walk around and have no traffic, have nothing out there. It was a very eerie feeling. This was a shared experience, not just across North America, but around the world. The record amount of reduction in average daily traffic was astounding, right? I mean, we all experienced this. If we step back, and really my presentation is about stepping back. If we step back, the theory we have on safety, particularly on pedestrian safety, is that safety is a function of how much we drive and how many mistakes that drivers make. Drivers go about their business, they make mistakes cause crashes, and so there's a correlation in a sense between how much we drive and how many fatalities and how many traumatic injuries we see on our roadway. And so with this theory, the theory based on drivers making mistakes and essentially user error of the system, with a lot fewer people driving, there should have been a lot fewer crashes, right? There should have been a lot fewer deaths. Of course, I think all of us know that that's not what happened, right? It went in the opposite direction. And traumatic injuries and fatalities on roadways have continued to climb in the years subsequent to that March of 2020 pivot point. Even though we've seen traffic have fewer or less, let's call it less spikiness, fewer peaks. Peaks have been lower, work from home and other changes in our living arrangements have actually flattened out the traffic stream. So even though we have seen dramatic changes in our driving patterns, we've continued to see fatalities go up. And so the question I have is, how do we explain this? How do we explain this given the predominant safety paradigm of driver error being the cause of crashes? I'm going to say how we have explained this, and then I'm going to tell you why I think it's wrong. The primary way that we have gone about explaining this, particularly to the public at large, is to focus on reckless driving and to focus on the reckless driver, right? And I've kind of indicated a little trademark here because it is something that we've seen pop up over and over and over in all different scenarios, coming from official channels, you know, USDOT, other traffic safety officials and studies. We've seen this pop up over and over again. I'm just going to show you a series of newspaper headlines, but you'll get the gist. 2020 fatality data shows increase in traffic fatalities, and then the subhead, risky driving behaviors, including failure to wear a seatbelt, speeding, and drinking while driving, identified as contributing factors. The idea is that the pandemic started and we all kind of were broken, right? We all became crazy and started driving without a seatbelt and speeding and drinking while driving. Pedestrian death rates spike as reckless driving surges. Fatalities are climbing to record levels. 2 years into the pandemic, authorities cite drivers' anxiety levels, larger vehicles, and fraying social norms. Again, we've become worse people. We are not only more reckless, we are just kind of broken people. It's not your imagination. Drivers have gotten a lot more reckless. Crash deaths have surged during COVID. Here's why. And in this particular article, which comes from the LA Times, you get this quote: reckless driving is, quote, a sign of the overall lack of consideration we're showing for other citizens, whether it be wearing masks or not getting vaccinated or how we drive. It's very aggressive. It's very selfish. I think this narrative is very human. Let me put it that way. I think that all of us, particularly those of us that routinely walk or bike, but even people who drive, all of us have experienced reckless driving. All of us have experienced aggressive driving, right? And so when we're told that this kind of thing is increasing, we all have anecdotal proof in the recesses of our own brains that kind of affirm our own experience, right? This is a very human narrative. I also think it's wrong. Let me give you what I think is the correct way to think about this. And I'm going to put this out there because it does challenge a lot of what we think about or how we think about safety, particularly safety for people who are biking and people who are walking. This is a very happy chart. It's a chart that my fellow engineers like to share. In the red here, from left to right, you have deaths per billion miles traveled. We like to measure this in a rate per mile traveled. So you see that over time, things have gone down. On the blue line, the one that starts in the lower left and goes to the upper right, is vehicle miles traveled. You can see we're driving a lot more. The way that the engineers and traffic safety professionals would describe this is to say, we're driving a lot more, but fewer people are dying. And you know, this is a very good thing. This is a kind of result of all of our great work in engineering and safety and all the things we've done to make things safer. Here's the results. We can see them in front of us. Here's another chart. This one is labeled average annual per commuter traffic delays over time. When I'm speaking to non-technical audiences, I like to point out this is congestion, right? It's another way to say, it's a technical way to say congestion. All of us know and understand that over time, congestion has gone up and up and up, and the amount of delays that we're having have gone up and up and up as well. Let's put these two together. And to me, I feel like the correlation here is very suggestive, right? The more roadways and streets and stroads and everything else, our arterials have become congested, the safer things have become. It's very hard to kill someone when you're driving bumper to bumper traffic, right? It's very hard to get in a fatal crash when you're going 0 miles an hour or at a very low speed. And what we saw prior to COVID, prior to March of 2020, was that traffic congestion had its own calming effect, which in a sense was reducing the amount of death that we were seeing on our roadways. After March of 2020, the congestion disappeared. And the over-engineered, over-aggressive state of many of our local streets, many of our arterials, our collector roads, the stroads that we have built ubiquitously across North America, was no longer calmed by having congestion. And so what you saw was drivers took advantage of that kind of aggressive design to drive faster. And the faster speeds led to higher deaths, led to more traumatic injury, led to the trends that we've seen. This all goes back to an understanding of forgiving design. And I'm an engineer. When I was an undergrad, we were taught forgiving design. I've spoken to more recent grads and they don't know this term. It's just referred to as design now. I get that, I understand. But it's important to go back to I think the early days of the post-war engineering profession and the problems that they were trying to solve. When you have two vehicles driving in opposite directions, we understand that sometimes a driver will float a little bit in their lane. And we wanted, with the design, forgive that mistake. We don't want that mistake to be fatal. And so what we do is we widen out the lanes. We give them a little bit more room to move. And then we understand that drivers sometimes go off the edge of the roadway, and we want to forgive that mistake too, because we don't want that to be fatal. And so we give a little bit of recovery room. And then if someone loses control of their vehicle entirely and goes off the road, we don't want them to hit something that will not give or will not, will absorb all that kinetic energy quite abruptly. And so we remove the trees and other obstacles and create a clear zone. And now we have a forgiving design. This is a genius set of insights and innovations that come from the early days of the engineering profession. It was an insight that drivers will consistently make mistakes. We can go in, observe those mistakes, understand those mistakes, and then compensate for them through our designs. Drivers are human, drivers make mistakes. And so as engineers, we should acknowledge that and compensate for them. This approach has saved millions of lives. I showed that chart earlier with the red line that went from the upper left to the lower right that was showing the reduction in death. Much of that line is attributed to forgiving design, right? If we had the same death rate per mile traveled that we had in the mid-1930s, instead of having 40,000 plus people a year die, we would have over 500,000 people a year die. Most of that is because we design our highways to be much, much safer. But the problem with forgiving design is that, of course, when we bring it into complex urban areas, when we bring it into areas where we have economic development, we have cars that are turning in and out of traffic, we have cars that stop, we have cars that park, we have people walking, we have people biking, we have people in wheelchairs. When we bring forgiving design principles into complex urban and suburban areas, what we do is we send a false signal to drivers. We tell drivers, we've got your back. We've forgiven your mistakes. We've created extra room for you. And drivers, because they are human, use that extra room, that extra space we've given them to drive faster, to achieve higher levels of performance. If you go to the manual and uniform traffic control devices, I think this is kind of, just emblematic of, I think, the challenge we face now in the engineering and design professions. If you try to discern the difference between designing a street in a complex urban environment, or even in a suburban environment, which has less complexity, but still enough turning movements and randomness to create these very dangerous situations. If you go to the manual and uniform traffic control devices and say, what is the difference between a local street and, say, a highway? If you look up the definition of street, it literally says street, see highway. It treats them as the same exact thing. And so we essentially have no set of standards, no real design approach, no real ethic or understanding of context between the highways that we're building and local streets, which function very, very differently, which humans function very differently within. This gives us this all too familiar scenario where designers will, looking at a street, say, we're going to create extra safety margin by designing for 60 miles an hour. And then we sign it for 25 miles an hour because that is what the neighborhood context calls for. And then people will drive between 40 and 45 miles an hour, kind of splitting the difference in the tension between what the design speed is and what an actual safe speed would be. All of this goes back to, I think, our understanding of humans and the way humans work. I referred to kind of the genius insight of forgiving design. And I think it is a genius insight because it recognizes what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky recognized. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talked about two systems of thinking, system one and system two. System one being your intuition, your instinctual. If I ask you what is 1 + 1, everybody knows that it's 2. You don't have to dig into the deep recesses of your brain to figure that out. But if I ask you what 4,750 plus 5,420 is, someone on this call can probably do that very quickly. Most of us, especially without pad and paper, would have to stop, think, shove everything else out of our brains, carry the one focus. This is system 2. This is the rational, very thoughtful, focused side of our brain. It is very difficult for us to be in system 2 for very long. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of focus and concentration. We spend almost all of our time operating in system 1. And this is the reality that early traffic engineers understood. They understood that driving is a system 1 activity. It's something that humans do intuitively without having to think very deeply. A lot of pedestrian advocates, a lot of safety advocates like to believe that driving is a system 2 activity, something that when you get behind the wheel, you have this immense responsibility to be absolutely focused 100% on driving this, machine of death, and anything that happens is a consequence of your lack of attention, your quote unquote recklessness. But the reality is that all of us have driven in an automobile where we have felt comfortable talking to someone in a passenger seat, or listening to a song on the radio, maybe even singing along. We don't consider these things reckless because when we drive, most of our brain is free to do other things. Driving is a system 1 activity. Once we understand this, we understand why engineers migrated to forgiving design for highways. They recognized one truism, one uncomfortable truth, and that is that people will tend to drive the speed that they feel comfortable driving, regardless of any other factor. We can put up all kinds of signs, all kinds of warnings, all kinds of things, and we recognize that it might change people's behavior in the short term. They might react to something new. They might react to the state trooper on the side of the road by slowing down, but the next time they drive that corridor, particularly if it's familiar to them, when they reach that state trooper, the place where the trooper was and the trooper's not there, they're not going to receive the mental note to slow down. They're going to drive the speed they feel comfortable driving, regardless of any other factor. This is what we see as well on local streets. This makes these kind of campaigns, and this one's out of TxDOT, but we've seen them in Maryland, we've seen them in other places. This makes these kind of campaigns patently, offensive, really. They fail to not only deal with safety, they fail to reach the driver in any meaningful kind of way. I think they do it in a way that is not only demeaning, but really beneath people who are advocates of traffic safety. The idea that we can shame people into changing their behavior is just an outright misunderstanding of the way the human brain works and the way humans respond to the stimulus around them. I like to point out, this would be a lot like having an obesity campaign in your office, where you were trying to reduce, obesity problem within your, promote healthy eating. And what you did is you went out and bought a bunch of donuts and cookies and salty snacks and filled the break room up with them and gave them to people for free, but then put a sign on the back of the bathroom stall about eating healthy. I think we all intuitively understand what people would do, right? When you get hungry or you get tired or all this stuff is there in front of you, you're not going to remember that message that you got 10 minutes ago when you were in the bathroom. This is just not how humans work. So the standard engineering approach, which engineers take a lot of flack for when it comes to speeding, is to go out and do a speed study. And is there excessive speeding? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, you raise the posted speed limit. This is actually the right thing to do on a highway, because on a highway, people will drive the speed they feel comfortable driving. And we know that differential in speed is the greatest indicator of danger on a highway. When you have people driving artificially low because there's a low speed limit, and you have the vast majority of people driving the speed they feel comfortable, you will have differential in speed and you will have a lot of crashes. But when we get to streets, when we get to urban areas, when we get to areas where there's complexity, where there's all this turning movements and everything else, this is the wrong approach. We go out and conduct a speed study. Is there excessive speeding? Yes. We need to actually change the street design. We need to actually change the signal that we're sending to drivers. There's a saying we have at Strong Towns: if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you designed your street wrong. A street that actually slows traffic down does the opposite of forgiving design, right? Instead of widening lanes, it narrows lanes, it tightens things up. Instead of creating an edge recovery area, it removes that recovery area. Instead of removing all the trees and all the obstacles on the edge, it brings them in and tightens things up. We signal to drivers that, hey, if you go fast, bad things can happen. And guess what? Drivers start to drive more slowly. This is a foreign concept to many of us. It's the exact opposite of what we've been taught. It's the exact opposite of what's in our design manuals, but it's where we need to go if we want things to become safer, particularly for people out walking and people out biking. We do a lot of this work at Strong Towns. If you're not familiar with us, strongtowns.org. We publish new content every day of the week, and would love to have you there and have you be part of our conversation. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jill, who I think is going to lead us through some Q&A.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to our speakers for some really informative presentations. Throughout the webinar, we've been assembling questions from the audience, but you can continue submitting questions throughout the discussion. We'll get in as many as we can until 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So let's get started. I have a question for Michael. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that only 2% of land is walkable communities. How did you determine the percentages of walkable land? And can you describe the analysis that determined this? What metrics or measures did you use to classify the 4 types or forms and functions?
Yeah, so the report outlines our methodology in more detail, but effectively we have 2 measures that we base walkability off of. One was the National Walkability Index that we find in the EPA Smart Location Database. And that's based off of various measures of the physical environment, transit measures, a couple other indicators that go into the EPA Smart Location Database. That's the National Walkability Index. That's one component of it. The second one is we use a measure that the American Enterprise Institute, of all organizations, came up with. They have something at their housing center they call the Walkable Oriented Destination, WOD, and that's a point of interest based walkability measure that looks at 6 important points of interest like grocery stores, pharmacies, things like that, and identifies which areas are within a 15-minute walk shed from those. So 2 measures, one from the AEI Walkable Oriented Development, the other one from the NWI in the EPA Smart Location Database. We do some maths, put all that together, and that's how we get the walkability measure.
Great, thank you. For Matt, someone asks about basic community needs, including medical care, educational facilities, and recreational facilities that have business models that depend on folks accessing destinations from different points of origin that are beyond walkable distances. How are these considered?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Our report is focused on how to design streets and other public spaces. So the county does not operate paratransit. It's operated by WMATA on our behalf. So there are opportunities for people to use transit to get to places. That's not the focus of this report. The report is not focusing on how you get to downtown Silver Spring or how you get to Olney or how you get to Rockville Center. The report is focused on when you get there, how do you get around, and how do you get around safely. So we're not looking at how to make paratransit work better. We're looking at how to make sidewalks and crosswalks and bus stops work better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of gets to the idea that we're all pedestrians at some point, whether it's to walk across the street to our doctor's office or, you know, walk down the street to go to the grocery store. Thank you. For Chuck, how can we use speed cameras? The Maryland, DC region has resorted to them a lot to reinforce good driving behaviors and adherence to speed limits.
I think that Strong Towns is going to be putting out a booklet early next year on speed cameras, because I've been pretty outspoken critic of speed cameras. And not from like a libertarian kind of standpoint. I mean, I do think that there are places where they make sense, but I've outlined 3 kind of parameters on where they make the most sense, and I think where they can be the most effective. First, if a majority of people are speeding, That's not a speed camera issue. That's not something you can deal with speed cameras. You have some underlying design problem you need to deal with. Get out there with cones and bollards and figure this out. Speed cameras should be about deviant behavior outside the norm. If the norm is speeding, you've got a design problem. So deploy them where you have people who are operating outside of the norm in a very dangerous situation. I think the second thing then is that the money that you collect from this should not go to the general fund. It can't be money that your city or your community or your state or whatever becomes dependent on, because the idea here is that you want to make streets safer over time. If you're just bringing in revenue, it's not like a good outcome, because that means a lot of people are speeding in a place where they shouldn't be speeding, where it's dangerous. And so this brings me to the third point, which is recycle that revenue that you get from the speed camera into actual physical changes to make the environment in that location safer. And so, you should have a goal, in a sense, over time of eliminating the need and effectiveness of that camera, because the environment just became much, much, much safer.
Great, thank you. This is a question that is geared, I think, towards everyone, because it's an issue that has come up in past webinars and Walkinars as well. How do you convince elected officials that narrowing streets and designing roads to slow drivers is a valid approach if the number of collisions increase substantially during the time when drivers are adjusting to new conditions?
I mean, I think that sort of proves the point. If people, just like Chuck was saying, people were driving less, they became more risky, despite they were driving more recklessly, despite not driving as much in the aggregate. Though also we know they weren't driving as much, but they were also driving more on our local streets. So we shifted the composition of our driving during COVID. So it was more on local streets and and streets like that, and off of the interstate and major highways, which then puts you right into significantly more VMT near where the pedestrians are. So how do I convince them to say we should narrow the streets? Well, we should narrow the streets because a lot of people are dying. In our Dangerous Die Design report that we put out, we see that pedestrian deaths actually went up during the COVID period, exactly like we were saying. We would have expected them, by the math, by the theory, they should have gone down. But they did not. They went the opposite direction. Pedestrian deaths were up in the last years over the COVID period. And this is like we keep saying here, and Chuck keeps saying, it's a design issue. At a certain point, you just need to get these places safer, narrower, better design, and safer for pedestrians. It's how we convince them. We keep trying to show them data like Dangerous by Design. We keep trying to educate them that the economy doesn't crash if you eliminated parking spaces somewhere, that in order to contribute to better design, or did a road diet, that businesses will still continue to flourish, that the sun will still rise on the east after you've done that. So, and there's a lot of good case studies, I think, is the other way, identifying good communities that have done the work, that have bothered to do this, and showing that things were fine. If anything, not just fine, they got better because they actually saw observed improvements in safety.
I'll just add real quick. I feel like we as professionals too can start to shift this cultural conversation we're having. I've seen so many reports. Allstate a few years back put out a report that said Massachusetts is the most dangerous state for driving in the country. And I looked at that and I was like, that can't be right. And I dug into the data, and what it is they had the most claims in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the lowest in death rate in per mile traveled. They had a lot of fender benders. They had a lot of people bumping into each other. They had a lot of claims. And if you're Allstate, you don't like claims. But the most dangerous state in the country that year was Montana and Wyoming, where you have wide open roadways and per mile travel, it was the highest death rate. Allstate had them as one of the safest. This is just wrong. It's backward. And yeah, I think we as professionals can talk about this differently too. I would trade thousands of fender benders for one death. And we seem often as professionals unwilling to have that conversation.
Right.
And I think on a tangential point, that there's been work over at IIHS, the highway safety folks, about looking at the composition of the vehicles. Right now, as we know, or you may not know, your vehicle safety rating is predicated on how survivable the person inside of the vehicle is when there is a crash. It does not care at all how likely it is for your sub-tank of a vehicle to kill a pedestrian. And the truth is that vehicles have been becoming, by the size of them, are more dangerous. An F-150 2022 is far more dangerous when it hits a pedestrian, more likely to kill that pedestrian. It's heavier, bigger, taller, hits a pedestrian or a cyclist at a specific angle than 15 years ago or so, and so on and so on. I'm picking on F-150 because it's the best-selling car or truck in the United States, but every other type of vehicle has gone that direction. We do not rate vehicles on their external factors, and there's efforts at the federal government, USDOT, to try and change that so that we actually know what the safety rating is for vehicles outside of the vehicle. How dangerous is it for the external environment, not just the person inside the vehicle or the vehicle itself.
Interesting. Thank you. This is a question for Matt. You're doing some really innovative work. How have you worked with the state DOT to get some of these designs into recommended guidelines and or traffic standards at the state and federal level? And Chuck and Mike might have some perspectives on that as well. Matt?
Yes, so another great question. We have been working, we haven't been working directly with the state about trying to get the state standards updated yet. We're still trying to get our own house in order to some degree by creating county standards. But we are participating in some federal research projects that we hope will lead to federal guidance. A lot of this stuff is just, there's not great guidance on it yet nationally. And so everybody out there who's trying to do anything kind of has to make up the rules as they go, and that's not good for anybody. So we are working with some TCRP reports on that. We would love to work with MDOT to work on these sorts of projects. Really, the only thing that we've done is, as we're working on projects, we have to get permits from the state sometimes. So working through that. Our experience so far has been that MDOT really wants to follow the exact ADA guidelines. They don't want to go above and beyond because it's not tested, it's not proven. If they go above and beyond, there might be exposure there. So working through kind of saying, like, the ADA is a floor, it's not a ceiling. We're trying to go above and beyond. Our goal is not to just do the minimums. Our goal is to do best practices and to be an example for other jurisdictions across the country. But we're still very early in this process. But we're happy to work with any jurisdictions that want to work with us to make the world a better place.
I will just add that we're trying to get cities to recognize the authority that they have. A lot of city public works departments, engineering departments, approaches feel very constrained by state guidelines, design guidelines, federal design guidelines. Beyond the ADA, they feel like they can't have minimum street widths on their own streets, on streets that are not state aid routes or otherwise funded by state. They have lots more leeway than they think they do. And what we're trying to do is help them recognize the authority they have to promote safety in their own community by stepping outside of the constraints of those state guidelines and actually creating a different culture of design on the streets that they fully control, with the hope that that work will filter its way up with other people who, like the other two panelists here, who are pushing from the top down, and that somehow we'll be able to kind of squeeze the bad practices out ultimately.
Great. This is a question for Chuck. Our community tried using advisory lanes and removing the center line along a stretch of roadway approaching a school that was largely unwalkable. Drivers pushed back because they didn't like navigating the uncertainty. Advisory lanes went away. I feel like we caved too early. How could we have addressed their objections more effectively?
I get this all the time where like we did something and drivers didn't like it. And I don't understand that as a design metric. Like I don't get that, because you can say like we did this and people walking didn't like it. You never hear that, right? Like the people on bikes didn't like it. The students didn't like it. I don't understand that as a design metric. I understand it as a political metric. So the question was, how do we get beyond this? And I think what we have to do when we do things like this is we have to set up a kind of upfront safety protocol. Like, here's what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. Here's the problems we're trying to deal with. We go out and do speed study. We go out and do traffic study. We go out and like collect real data. How many people are crossing? How safe does it feel? We interview people. We do all this. We get like preliminary data. Then we put the change in place. And ideally, we can even do this temporarily. So we can lower the stakes and say like, look, we're going to test this out, but here's what we're hoping to see. And then we can go and measure whether we see those things, whether we experience that improvement in safety, improvement in people's capacity to walk across, people remarking that they feel safer or have a safer experience. And then when we get to the end and the driver says, well, I'm no longer able to drive at 40 miles an hour with absolute confidence, I don't like this as much. We'll say, well, okay, that's a data point. Like, we appreciate that data point, but here's other data we've gathered along the way that, in a sense, affirms or confirms what we set out to do in the first place. When we use driver like frustration as our metric, I don't get that on a street. Like, drivers will be frustrated if they feel like they should be able to drive at highway speeds on local streets. That is an outcome that we're actually like is a positive outcome.
Right. Anyone else want to add to that, sort of the political versus data implications of our decision making? Nope. Okay.
Let me, one of the things we say at Strong Towns all the time is don't show up to an emotions fight with data. I mean, we do tons of data, and like data is very, very important, but data affirms your emotions. It doesn't change your emotions. And if you show up to an emotions fight with data, you will lose. And so if you're going to have this conversation, you need to actually deal with the emotions up front. You need to calm people down, say, here's what we're trying to do, and then the data will reinforce it. But if you just say, we're going to go out and make this change because it will be better, trust us, and then people freak out, like you're setting yourself up to lose, because data will not win you that fight.
Great. This is another question for Chuck. It's a good one, I think. Chuck, you once said, my suburban hometown is going away. I became a planner because I was generally concerned with how development was occurring in my town as well. Based on the first presentation, I guess, Michael, if you want to weigh in on this too, based on the first presentation, the need to make non-walkable communities walkable, is it still your stance on car-dependent suburban communities that they're going to go away, or is an evolution to walkable possible for those communities?
So the idea that suburban cities will go away packs about 200 pages of my first book into one very provocative sentence. I don't know the exact community we're talking about, and I would be hesitant to predict any specific city would go away. I think the suburban development pattern is very challenged financially, and I think that there's going to be an evolution there. In some places, there will be a thickening up, which in our language would be becoming more complete neighborhoods, more walkable places, more bikeable places, more kind of localized economic ecosystems. And I think some places will be denuded, where like they will be depopulated and things will go away, and maybe buildings will even be salvaged. I think that the path for any suburban community today is to say, how do we become more of a place? How do we become not a collection of homes that commute into someplace else, but how do we actually start to provide things that are alternatives to auto trips here in our neighborhood? So if everybody drives to a restaurant on Friday evening, cool. How do we make that restaurant as food trucks in the local park that we can walk to? How do we start with a corner store? What is that next step? And we see this happening right now. This is not like some foreign concept. I mean, there are places out doing this. I think the places that can embrace this the most robustly will be the places in the best position over the next couple decades.
Yeah, and there's a nexus here to people with disabilities as well, because the boomers are aging very rapidly. My parents live in an area that is entirely unwalkable. They have to drive for every single trip, and my dad just had to give up his driver's license. So let's think about it. Like, think about your perspective. If you had to give up your driver's license today, could you survive, right? What would you have to change in your life? Would you be able to get the life necessities? And so there is definitely, as the boomers age, in place in many cases, they may develop more disabilities, they may lose the ability to drive. How do they survive in the world that we've built? Can they survive in the world that we've built? That's a real question.
Yeah, I butt heads a lot sometimes with some of my urbanist friends who I might call central city snobs, who might be just annoyed that anyone dares to live outside of a core city, because a substantial amount of our population does not live inside core cities. That's a fact of life. Number two, a lot of these areas, I don't think they're going away in the sense that they will just disappear, because in 9,000 years of urban history, there are very few human settlements that ever just stopped being settled. It tends to be an endurable pattern. People will still live there, and even in extreme cases like the Centralia, Pennsylvania famous case study of there's a coal fire burning underneath their feet, and there's still holdouts of people who want to live there. There's a lot of sociology behind this. The point being, I think people were still going to live in communities all around the country, and we're better off helping places like that retrofit or evolve into some places that are safer, that are more amenable to different ways of life for older folks to be able to actually get around in their communities, and not just keep doubling down on, if they were built or expanded primarily around a 20th century concept of urbanism, they don't have to continue to be that. They can be a community that builds towards something else. That's quite possible. So these places, yeah, a lot of places will probably will get smaller. They won't lose everybody, but they'll get smaller in some instances. But even in those instances, you're better off finding ways to have places where you're more concentrated and have slightly denser development than just saying we're going to completely just keep doing 20th century all over again.
Right. Great. Thank you so much. And I see we're 10 minutes over our time. So I'm going to ask each of you to sort of give a summary statement or address any issues that you hoped to address but didn't get time to address, or questions, things that you might want to bring up that wasn't in your presentation. And then we will call it a day. It's been a great conversation. So we'll start with Michael.
Not much to add. I'd ask all of you, we're happy at Smart Growth America to work with communities all across the US. So please contact myself directly or anyone at SGA of how to get us working with your community. We're happy to help all of you do great research to identify case studies or involve you in many of the lines of stuff that we do, whether it's transportation, complete streets, or any of the other organizations. So a bit of a plug, please check us out, and happy to work with you.
Thank you.
I'll just thank MDOT and Maryland Planning for the opportunity to speak about the work that we're doing in Montgomery County. I understand that the link to the report has been posted in the chat. I would just encourage everyone to take a look at it. It's really dense. It's not a hugely long report, but it's filled with information about how you can make your community safer and more accessible. and how you can have conversations with people who have disabilities in your community more effectively about those design choices. So we are really excited to be working on these kinds of projects. And if you are a Montgomery County resident or a nearby jurisdiction and you want to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me. We would love to work with more people.
Likewise, thank you very much for the opportunity. I feel like we have a lot of challenges. I'm reminded often of my father-in-law, who is a civil engineer who was involved in the early days of the highway expansions here in Minnesota. As a young man, he was out working on those projects, and I remember sharing with him my first book and sitting down with him and having him kind of reflect on his career. And that was a difficult conversation, because it's hard to look and say, wow, we did a lot of things really well. We did a lot of things really, really poorly. And I think our natural human instinct is to feel a little bit defensive about that. I think that it's time that we be generous with each other and recognize that people with good intentions try to do the best they could, and that we need to now today kind of step back and say, all right, that worked here, it didn't work here. And we can work together now with the resources we have to build some beautiful places that people can thrive in and prosper in. I think, Matt and Michael have both brought up some really great resources that can help us do that. And I guess I would just encourage us all to open our hearts and open our minds and try. Every time I talk to professional groups, technical people tend to be very defensive because they think you're attacking them. It's less about attacking and more about having an internal conversation about how we become better at what we do. And I hope everybody can take it in that spirit. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So thank you to our speakers for sharing their really important work. This concludes the formal portion of our fourth and final 2023 Walkinar. I would like to encourage you to remain involved by reviewing and sharing your thoughts on the Maryland statewide bicycle and pedestrian master plan. Comments are being accepted through November 20th. These comments will be incorporated into a final plan that is set to be adopted in January of 2024. Review the plan and submit feedback at 2050marylandbpmp.com. Now, I'd like to offer my gratitude for the presenters and to those of you who attended for great discussion on issues related to equity. Thank you to everyone who attended today, and a special thank you to Francine Waters at the Maryland Department of Transportation, without whom this year's very successful Walkinar series would not have been possible, and to John Coleman, who helps make all of our webinars run smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online soon, and when you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short survey evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide your feedback so we can improve the webinar experience. All attendees are also going to receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation that can be used to claim other continuing education credits. Keep an eye on your email box for details on future smart growth and planning related webinars, including our next webinar on rethinking greenways, scheduled for October 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We hope you can join us next week. Have a great day.